The Castlevania series at this point probably needs little introduction, being such an immensely prolific, influential, and well-loved gaming franchise since its inception in 1986. And while there is no shortage of excellent coverage on the history of this series already out there, I'd still like to document my own personal journey and reflections from completing each and every title myself, regardless of its generally perceived quality or difficulty. So in the first installment of my full series of retrospectives today, we'll whip out the groundbreaking original on the Famicom disk system and NES, its numerous ports and alternate versions on various platforms, its first forays into the arcades, and check out some remakes and reimaginings. So let's step up to Dracula's ominous castle gates and embark on a quest to deeply explore every Castlevania game. So this legendary series would officially be unleashed to the world on September 26, 1986, with the release of Akumajo Dracula in Japan, published and developed by Konami for the Famicom disk system, and would later be released for the NES in North America in 1987 and in Europe in 1988 as Castlevania. It has a slightly nicer ring to it than Dracula's Satanic Castle, which was the rough translation of the Japanese title that freaked out Konami of America's VP to the point of tweaking the title into what would permanently stick for the franchise. You play as Simon Belmont, a part Conan, part Indiana Jones kind of guy, armed with a magic whip passed down to him through generations of his vampire hunting family, and tasking himself with ridding Transylvania of a recently resurrected Count Dracula and his demonic minions, many of which also designed with heavy inspiration from classic horror films. The game's creator, Hitoshi Akamatsu, wanted to create an action game with a cinematic feel, resulting in a platformer drenched in gothic atmosphere with an unprecedented level of detail and polish for its time. The game opens up in the courtyard of the Count's castle, an ominous but safe place to familiarize yourself with the game's somewhat clunky but very deliberate and methodical control scheme that would define the early games of the series. You can move left and right at a consistent speed, but notably your jump height and distance is locked down with no mid-air adjustment available. Your whip attack also has a very slight delay with a brief animation, so being deliberate and thoughtful with your movement is paramount to your survival. And by whipping the torches outside, you will also discover your first whip upgrades, making your whip more powerful and eventually longer, and your first of many sub-weapons, used by pressing up and attack, and using the hearts you gather up as a counter for ammunition. And once you get in the front door, you're immediately greeted by hordes of undead creatures and vicious critters, not to mention one of Simon's most formidable opponents, stairs. You can't jump on or off of these, and must slowly traverse them from each step, leaving you fairly vulnerable to attack. Simon does have a health bar, with enemies doing increasingly more damage to you as the game progresses, but notably all enemies will also knock you backwards, a mechanic that gets exponentially more dangerous once you're also surrounded by numerous death pits. And to get any of your health back, you'll need to search around for the iconic wall meat, hidden in various blocks throughout the game. And if you're really thorough, you might uncover some secret bonus point items. And getting back to the sub-weapons, there are a handful of them that really introduce a lot of different fighting strategies that can be very effective for different playstyles or for specific moments of the game. Not to mention double and triple shot upgrades that can increase the quantity of projectiles you can throw in succession. Whether you freeze time with the watch, stun lock your foes with holy water, or fill the screen with arcing axes and boomerang-like crosses, there's no shortage of ways to approach every situation or boss fight. There's a total of 6 distinct areas to work your way through, all connected and displayed during these interstitial map cutscenes, which reveal the layout and grand scope of this elaborate castle, along with sections of each area divided up by dramatic doorways, also acting as checkpoints in case you lose a life. Each area has its own unique look, with a lot of care and craft put into the atmosphere and stage design. It might look a bit rough in parts by modern standards, but if you compare this to other Konami games released on the Famicom that year, it's clearly on another level of artistry and effort. And we can't forget the iconic soundtrack either, exuding so much energy and momentum while still flavored with dread and horror, and it really pulls the aesthetics together in an unforgettable way. There are so many classic themes here that would define the series to come, and it's no surprise that this is often regarded as a landmark musical score on the system. The levels also ramp up in difficulty, with the new monsters being introduced with increasingly erratic and troublesome behaviors to react to. And it's quite the cast of creatures here, many of which becoming mainstays of future games to follow, from the bats, birds, and notorious Medusa heads, to the mutant fish dudes, bone-throwing skeletons, fire-spewing skeledragons, crazed hunchback fleamen, and the list goes on. The boss fights are also very memorable, almost pulling a direct roster of classic horror movie monsters into play here, with a giant vampire bat, a disembodied Medusa head, a duo of bandage-hurling mummies, Frankenstein's monster and a pesky Igor, and of course the infamous Grim Reaper. These battles can be a true test of your abilities, or perhaps a test of your knowledge of sub-weapon exploits. Like if you're caught in a battle with the Grim Reaper without a sub-weapon, you'll be frantically dealing with an onslaught of roving sickles, all while some holy water cheese strats or filling the screen with a barrage of crosses might just make short work of him. And all of this builds up to a dramatic climax of traversing a dilapidated bridge swarming with giant bats, climbing your way through a hectic clock tower, and finally reaching Dracula's quarters, engaging in a tense battle requiring a substantial level of precision required to avoid his fireballs as he teleports around the room, eventually whipping his head clean off, which then leads to a monstrous second phase that continues to fire off projectiles at you while he tries to crush you beneath his talons. A form unofficially and adorably coined as the Cookie Monster. Now, if you can survive, a wave of relief washes over you as you watch that castle crumble. It's such a great feeling, whether it's for the first time or for the 100th time. This is not an easy game for sure, but another thing I love about this game is its flexibility and difficulty, not only thanks to its unlimited continues, which are much appreciated while you're initially learning the game, but you can also really push yourself further, whether you decide to try the more dangerous second loop, or perhaps restrict your use of sub-weapons, or maybe even deprive yourself of whip upgrades entirely. Personally, in my own Castlevania challenge underway here, I managed to beat the game without dying, and maybe someday I'll take a crack at a whip-only run, which would especially increase the difficulty of the boss fights. A few other things to note here are some of the slight differences across various releases. The original Famicom Disk System version includes the ability to save your progress, so it does have a unique menu here, along with a musical theme not heard in the NES cartridge port. And of course, you'll have some brief but unavoidable loading time between the stages. Otherwise, the game itself is essentially the same, other than different designs for the title screens. There's also a Famicom cartridge version released several years later in 1993, which not only removes the loading time, but also adds an easy mode, which gives you more hearts and lives to start with, no more knockback when you get hit. You can keep sub-weapons if you die, you can retain double and triple shot upgrades even if you get a new weapon, enemies deal less damage to you, and bosses take more damage. So it's drastically easier, but certainly a more approachable way to learn how the game operates for first-timers. And before we get into some of the other more different ports, or various other games bearing the Akumajo Dracula name, it's worth mentioning that several instances of this game have been re-released or repackaged numerous times over the years, the first of which hitting coin-op arcades at the time, either as a selection in a Nintendo Play Choice cabinet, or as part of Nintendo's dual-screen Versus series. Versus Castlevania sadly doesn't have any kind of simultaneous head-to-head competitive or cooperative play, but it does feature increased difficulty comparable to the second loop of the original, and it continues to scale up the challenge even more upon further full game clears. And it's got a pretty harsh time limit that really demands your speed or additional quarters. And it certainly has some bolder color choices, maybe in efforts to attract attention amongst competing arcade machines. But otherwise, the aesthetics and sound are intact. Beyond that, many fairly faithful emulated versions of Castlevania would be released, such as the Contra Castlevania Collection released for PC in 2002, or the 2004 Game Boy Advance port as part of its NES Classic series. And later, Castlevania would also see a release on the Wii Virtual Console, was included on the NES Classic device, or more recently, it's part of the Castlevania Anniversary Collection currently available on modern platforms. But however you want to play this one, I can't recommend this game enough. Not just as an important piece of history in the franchise, but as a great example of pure and classic action platforming on the NES, married perfectly with a tough but fair amount of challenge, and a very fun and vibrant horror aesthetic. Now interestingly, at the same time Konami was developing this for the Famicom Disk System, they had another team working on another aesthetically similar but conceptually quite different version of Akumajo Dracula that would release just 1 month later. But before we go down that path, I'd first like to run through a handful of more direct attempts to port the original game to various computers and mobile devices, and to really dig into the details of the differences here that I found after actually playing through each in their entirety, despite their reputations. So let's flash forward a bit to the year 1990, when the original Castlevania would be ported to 3 different computer platforms: the Commodore 64, MS-DOS, and the Amiga. The Commodore and DOS conversions were both handled by Unlimited Software, which was the porting division of Distinctive Software Incorporated, a Canadian company that would end up working with Konami on quite a few computer ports and unique titles around that time, such as the DOS port of Super Contra and Bart's House of Weirdness, just to name a couple titles that we've seen pop up on this channel and other videos here in the past. Getting into the Commodore version first, obviously the graphics have been altered for the hardware's capabilities, although everything is very recognizable and the faithfulness to the source material is commendable. The sprites and backgrounds just look a bit more rough and raw here, from Simon's block-shaped head to the dilapidated, glitchy-looking castle walls. But I'd say they did a fine job, assuming the developers were probably just given a copy of the NES game and told to play it and make a port from scratch. The level design, even down to the contents of candles and hidden treasure locations, is intact as well. So as you progress through the game, everything should feel very familiar. The Commodore's legendary SID chip also gets a pretty nice workout here in the audio department. The music kinda misses a few notes here and there, but it still captures the energy of the original soundtrack quite well, even if the timbre may be on the abrasive or shrill side at times. The game also has decent sound effects occurring at the same time as the music, which wasn't always a guarantee for Commodore 64 software. For whatever reason though, some of the level themes are mixed up in a different order. There was also a glitch I ran into where Dracula's final room just loops the game over theme over and over again, probably foreshadowing to my likely demise. But one major difference that quickly comes into play is the control scheme, which was accommodating to the one-button joystick for the Commodore. So instead of having a dedicated button to jump, you'll instead press up on the joystick to do so. It certainly takes some getting used to, especially when you're trying to climb stairs. Using up to jump also eliminates the possibility of hitting up and attack simultaneously to use your sub-weapons. So the workaround here is to instead hold down the attack button for a longer duration to fire these off. It certainly forces you to think ahead a little more, and it sadly significantly reduces the effectiveness of the double and triple shot upgrades. So yeah, it's a bit awkward, but it could have been much worse, as I'm reminded of the Commodore 64 version of Contra, which had you using the joystick to move, aim, and fire, all while using the keyboard spacebar to jump. So I'm thankful they didn't go that route. Despite the control differences, the game actually feels quite smooth and responsive to play. It runs a bit faster compared to the NES. Simon clips along at a pretty nice pace, and you can crack your whip much more rapidly than usual. I did run into the occasional eaten input here and there, but generally I was pretty impressed. I'd say the challenge level is also a bit higher than the NES version as well, but that may be partly due to my ingrained familiarity with the original and having to relearn the subtle differences in this port. One pretty big difference, however, which does change boss fight strats significantly, is that the holy water will no longer stun lock anything. I won't spoil the workaround for anyone out there who might want to try to tackle this game themselves, but I'll just say these battles are substantially harder without the right item. Speaking of harder, this game does not have continues, in the traditional sense anyway. Instead, you have an option to save your game at any time, which includes the number of hearts you have, your sub-weapon, and the number of lives you have remaining. You may want to pay close attention to the latter, as saving without any lives left and lacking an optimal sub-weapon might leave you in a rough place, and sometimes you might be better off starting over entirely. So be smart with that save scumming, and hopefully you can get the best of Drac and his scrambly-faced glory, and claim your rightful place at the top of Dracula's Hall of Blame. Next, we'll look at the port for MS-DOS, also handled by Unlimited Software. Castlevania's first appearance on PCs might at first appear a little bit closer to the NES version than the Commodore 64 did, as far as the sprites and tile set are concerned anyway, but it's still feeling a bit off. And of course, if you downscale the colors for CGA-compatible monitors, your eyeballs might melt faster than a sunbathing vampire. But the biggest graphical difference is easily noticeable once things start moving, with rather choppy animation and very jerky screen scrolling. Input lag and slower performance compound with this to make the game feel very sluggish, but for better or worse, it does make the game considerably easier as well. Much like the Commodore 64 version again, the levels and item locations are pretty accurate here, so really the main difficulty you'll be facing is adjusting to the lag and somewhat nauseating movement of the screen. It also takes the same approach to save functionality, so you won't be able to continue directly, but can still strategically make saves to work your way through Dracula's castle. Control-wise, you can either use your keyboard, or it also supports multi-button joysticks, so the control scheme can line up with the NES version with a dedicated jump button and firing sub-weapons as you normally would. But once again, Holy Water does not stun-lock any of the bosses, so you'll need to adapt your strategy accordingly. Another glaring difference is in the game's sound. It does support ad-lib, Tandy, or PC speaker, with ad-lib sounding perhaps the least offensive, with some gritty FM synthesized tones and sound effects. The PC speaker version is borderline torturous, especially if you have sound effects and music running in tandem, as the soundtrack is constantly overrun by the blooping alarm-like sounds of destroying anything. I will admit the PC speaker rendition of the score is pretty entertaining to listen to, at least just to hear a different take with such a limited resource for audio. The Tandy option is somewhere in the middle, still using similar bloopy sound effects, but without completely cutting off the music track. Overall, I would definitely say this is less pleasurable to play than the Commodore port, mostly since it's a bit of a headache to look at, and it's also perhaps a bit too easy. In my case, I was able to finish a whip-only run in just a couple of hours, as opposed to spending 10 hours to get my first clear of the Commodore port. And I may have to reuse an old joke here, and just say to leave this one as a morbid curiosity. Now things get rather interesting here as we arrive at the Amiga version, somehow utilizing the most powerful hardware capabilities of these three computer platforms and managing to create the most unhinged port of them all. Development duties here are courtesy of Novotrade, who not only worked on numerous computer games and conversions of popular console games at the time, but eventually would be well known for cult hits like Echo the Dolphin and Colibri, or perhaps reviled for their 3D takes on the Contra games for PlayStation 1, when they were called Appaloosa Interactive. And right off the bat, everything certainly seems more colorful and the quality of the sound is decent, and it's certainly a step up from the other computer ports. As for the controls, we unfortunately get the worst aspects of the other two ports combined. The up to jump and one available button dilemma seen on the Commodore, along with the sludgy lag and jerkiness that we got on DOS. I guess if there's anything nice I could say here, at least you can jump onto staircases and move very briskly up and down them. Otherwise, it's pretty miserable, and will take some determination to adapt to if you dare challenge this one. And for reasons we'll get into, this is probably the hardest title in today's video. But getting back into the wall meat of the game here, the level layouts are actually fairly spot on, just with a rather different and arguably garish look to just about everything, from the tile sets to the enemy sprites. It all appears completely redrawn with sometimes quite drastic artistic liberties. Some areas honestly have some cool ideas and atmosphere, like the underground sewer stage being overgrown with lush plant life. And then sometimes, you get a 5-legged horse with the word castle underneath it. Amazing. Some of the enemy and boss sprites look pretty wild now too, and I admittedly had a lot of fun seeing some of the rather cursed interpretations of them for the first time. Where the fun might end, however, depends on your threshold for torturous difficulty. A lot of things are working against you, even beyond the controls and game feel. Some of the enemies are a lot faster than they usually are, and the knockback is absolutely brutal in certain spots. I found some workarounds thanks to a longer amount of invincibility frames after you get hit, but you really have to plan a precise route accordingly if you're damage boosting through everything. This does at least also have that same save scumming setup as the other two ports, with quite the catch though. The further you get into the game, you might start to notice that some of your favorite sub-weapons are not in the candles that you expect them to be in. So if you make a save at the final bat bridge without already having the stopwatch, like I did, I got stuck here for hours until eventually getting over my stubbornness and started the game over again from the beginning. Overall, I think the perseverance was worth it, maybe, if at least just to face off with Gonzo Dracula. This fight was brutal, by the way. If he teleports directly on you, you have no chance to get away. So it's a bit of a slot machine situation to reach the Cookie Monster form, who has another absolutely jaw-dropping and glorious sprite update. All said and done, it took me a little over 11 hours to finally conquer this beast of a port with save scumming, and while it's something I doubt I will return to anytime soon, I feel like I can't not recommend checking this one out for jank enthusiasts, at least for a fascinating tour through all of the changes made in the artwork and sound. Speaking of jank, there were also a handful of Castlevania conversions for Java, designed for mobile phones. I'll be honest, there's a lot of varying information online regarding release dates on these, and I couldn't track down playable versions of every single one, but there were a few variants seemingly released between 2002 and 2006, at least for the official ones that Konami signed off on. The graphics range between a chunky pixelated look to a higher resolution 16-bit style, but all of them constrained to tiny screen sizes and cramped aspect ratios, and awkward phone keypad controls. And for audio, they all have a lack of sound effects and low-rent MIDI-driven soundtracks. Honestly, for the time, these play okay, all things considered. I guess it just goes without saying that playing platformers with a phone keypad is not ideal. In my personal jaunt through a couple of these, I did run into an incomplete paywall version that ends at the end of level 2, or one that flat out crashed on me nearing the end of the game, but eventually I did beat one version without continuing, perhaps since it had knockback removed for some reason. And beyond the first official Castlevania Java titles, there are also a wide array of unofficial NES emulations and unrelated games that just use Castlevania in the title. There's a rather vibrant scene of bootlegs more inspired by later games in the series, not to mention another unique and official Castlevania Java game, Order of Shadows from 2007, which we'll get into another time. So with the direct conversions covered, let's go back to 1986 and start to examine the other various forms of Akumajo Dracula, the original game title that would be reused in Japan for several releases that spin the original Castlevania on its head. If you remember earlier in the video, I had mentioned Konami had a separate development team working in parallel at the same time as the Famicom Disk System release, and with that crew creating something for the MSX2, a home computer system that was fairly popular at the time in Japan and a few other countries as well, and would be the home of several unique versions of Konami projects like Contra and Metal Gear. Akumajo Dracula would come out for the MSX just 1 month after the original version did, along with a 1987 release in Europe under the title Vampire Killer, predating when the Castlevania name had been created for the NES release. Now the story hasn't changed. You're still in control of Simon Belmont storming Dracula's castle, and aesthetically it looks quite similar, using many of the same sprites and tile sets, but with slightly altered color schemes, and the great soundtrack comes over as well, and sounds quite nice on the MSX sound chip. It's also still an action platformer at its core, with generally similar controls and movement, but it takes quite a different approach to its gameplay. An immediate noticeable difference is the lack of screen scrolling, something the MSX was not particularly capable of doing smoothly. So the action is split up amongst single screens that you can move back and forth between. This also leads us to actually having to explore each level instead of simply moving to the right, as your progress is gated by finding a hidden silver key that will unlock the door leading to the next stage. You can't go back to previous levels, so it's not a totally open world experience, but does introduce a rudimentary search action style of gameplay that would be expanded upon greatly and later define the general direction of the series. So you could kind of call this a proto-Simon's Quest or Symphony of the Night in some ways. And these silver keys are usually hidden within breakable walls, and the stages are also littered with candles that can be broken to pick up hearts and other items, not to mention other bronze keys that can be used to open up treasure chests. You can also encounter old crones who are sometimes out in the open or sometimes also hiding inside of walls, and if you whip them enough times, they will offer to sell you something in exchange for a quantity of hearts. Whip them too much and they either leave or die, I guess. I'm not sure. But be careful if they have something you want and you can't afford it yet. Either way, the concept of these item sellers would also make a return eventually in Simon's Quest, so it's pretty cool to see ideas like this in their formative inception. The items and sub-weapons are a mix of familiar ones, along with some that are completely new. You can upgrade to a more powerful chain whip, although notably it does not get any longer. And the dagger sub-weapon here is considerably more useful, as it doesn't cost any hearts to use, nor do you need any double or triple shot items to fire off tons of them at once. There are also boomerang-style axe and cross sub-weapons, which can be effective sometimes, but you must actually catch them upon their return, otherwise you lose them and revert back to the whip. Holy water is available as well, and it's carried separately from the other weapons and costs 5 hearts to use. Firing these off is a little awkward, as you must jump and then hit the left or right button again to throw one. An hourglass item replaces the functionality of the stopwatch, and again is carried separately from other items and is equally awkward to use, triggered by pressing down while you are in midair. Some other new items here include a couple of different shields you can carry that either reduce damage you take or deflect projectiles, or magic rings that make you temporarily invincible, boots that make you walk faster and jump further, candles that reveal the location of breakable walls, and books that increase or reduce the price of items, or even maps of the levels that annoyingly can only be looked at 3 times before they apparently disintegrate in Simon's grubby little hands. The items are in consistent locations, and as the levels gradually increase in complexity and difficulty, you'll need to consider which ones are essential to you as you design your route. Speaking of difficulty, this is certainly a toughie. The enemies and their behaviors haven't drastically changed, but are laid out in rather devious ways, compounded by screen-wrapping level designs that often try to disorient and confuse you. There's some especially downright dirty tricks near the end of the game that I won't spoil, but I can't really guarantee whether they will make you laugh or rage quit when you run into them. I will at least say that you should really read a translation of the manual to learn about an unusual button combination needed to traverse an especially maze-like sewer level. All of the same bosses are also present here and pop up between every 3 stages. And honestly, they aren't too bad, but you definitely will need to form certain strategies and have the right items, or simply enough health to have the best shot at victory. And after each boss fight, you sadly lose nearly all of your inventory, so you can't just calmly cruise your way onwards and must keep exploring to reacquire that essential gear needed to survive. To top all of this off, out of the box there are no continues and no ways to earn extra lives. Even health refilling orbs are not that easy to find, so brace yourself for a lot of trial and error here, unless you happen to have the Game Master cartridge, Konami's Game Genie-esque device for their library of MSX titles, that in this case allows you to continue, set the starting number of lives, or just select the stage that you want to play. If you get easily frustrated, you may want to go this route if you can, but personally I thoroughly enjoyed completing this one without it. I felt it was a really fascinating bridge between the original game and the eventual open-world direction of later Castlevanias. And I really had a blast figuring things out in my first playthrough. It undeniably has its flaws here and there, paywalling the ability to continue probably being the most egregious, but I'd say fans of the search action Metroidvania style of gameplay would be remiss to not experience how these concepts were first introduced into the series. And after hearing for years that this was one of the worst Castlevania titles in the franchise, I was so glad to give this one a proper shot and see for myself. The next Akumajo Dracula titled game to be released is a pretty divisive and infamous one, also known as Haunted Castle, released in North American and European arcades at the end of 1987 and in Japan in early 1988. While Castlevania's first adventurous sequel, Simon's Quest, had just released on the Famicom disk system a few months prior to this, Haunted Castle still takes a similar approach to the first Castlevania, with straightforward action platforming, but injected with classic arcade game sensibilities. You control Simon Belmont yet again, but a little plot twist in the opening sequence shows Dracula stealing away his bride, adding a little damsel in distress element to the story, but it's still just another excuse to go after the Count. And the game opens up in a spooky graveyard full of zombies, skeletons, and the other usual suspects, but all with much larger and more detailed sprites and a greater range of colors than what the NES could handle. The pixel art is pretty solid overall, really, although Simon's walk cycle does honestly seem like finding the nearest toilet is a higher priority than hunting vampires. The game feel isn't too far off from what you would expect, with its typical clunky and deliberate movement. You do have a slight amount of mid-air control during the neutral jumps, however, an aspect which definitely comes into play in a few of the precarious platforming sections. You start off armed with your trusty leather whip, and while weapon upgrades are sparse, you can eventually find a more powerful Morning Star or even a big broadsword, fully leaning into Simon's Conan the Barbarian cosplay. There are a few sub-weapons as well, cartoon-like bombs replacing the holy water, actual boomerangs that don't actually come back, the super useful stopwatch, a flaming torch, and a new crucifix item that shoots out a steady stream of crosses. Hearts are in shorter supply though, since there aren't any candles to smash, and you'll just need to grab the occasional ones dropped by dispatched foes. I personally didn't have many issues with the controls, but a common and understandable complaint is in Simon's much larger hurt box, and this combined with the slow movement can lead to taking lots of damage from enemies if you don't know what's coming next. And if you happen to miss a key weapon drop or upgrade, it can be expected to get overwhelmed by monsters. At this point, I should probably bring up the variety of revisions of this game that came out over time for various regions, the most notorious being version M, the original North American release, where even the introductory stage can devour your first quarter after getting hit just 2 or 3 times. Later revisions would be a little more forgiving. I played the Japanese release, where you do not take nearly as much damage, and even falling into pits simply drops you back to a checkpoint with a small health reduction. In all cases though, 1 credit equals 1 life. And in classic arcade Konami brutality, there is a limit on how many times you can continue. Or one other interesting way to play is to put in 4 credits at once, and instead of continuing, you will just have 1 massive health bar to try and complete the game with. Luckily in this day and age, you can also easily flip virtual dip switch settings to however you like. Difficulty aside, I thought there were actually some pretty awesome things going on in the stages themselves. There's a cool variety of landscapes and locations to whip your way through, and plenty of fun monsters and bosses to do battle with, many of which we hadn't seen in other titles yet. I think this game gets derided somewhat unfairly in the grand scheme of the franchise. While it certainly has its glaring flaws here and there, and it doesn't hit the level of quality of its NES counterparts, this seems pretty on par with other similar arcade hits of the time, like Rastan or Rygar, even despite a troubled production cycle that rushed the release of Haunted Castle without enough time to fully realize the original vision of the game. And, properly test it and balance the difficulty. These days, I'd still recommend playing this one with an open mind, especially if you start with one of the easier revisions and work your way up to version M if you really want to push yourself. If anything, the soundtrack alone is worth a listen, with some really great original themes and new versions of other great tunes from previous games. Aside from the arcade originals, Haunted Castle also received a bare-bones PS2 release in Japan, re-releases on modern platforms as part of Hamster's Arcade Archives series, or is also part of Konami's Arcade Classics Anniversary Collection, or the Castlevania Dominus Collection that came out in 2024. And that collection also contained one of the biggest recent surprises for the Castlevania franchise. And packaged alongside this collection of the 3 Nintendo DS Castlevania games was a full-blown remake of Haunted Castle, developed by M2, well known for their work on various retro game compilations and remakes. I'm not sure who asked for this, but man, what a wonderful shock this was. Haunted Castle Revisited is a complete reimagining of the arcade game, not unlike M2's previous work remaking Castlevania The Adventure as part of the Rebirth series of games for Nintendo's WiiWare service. And like that gem, again they have presented us with a clear homage to the classic Vania era with a gorgeous and well-executed 16-bit pixel art style, while still unmistakably paying tribute to the otherwise generally unloved Haunted Castle. Aside from the obvious graphical overhaul and wonderful remix soundtrack, many changes were made, such as the return of breakable candles, whip upgrades, and sub-weapons more in line with the original NES games. A few twists here though. There's a reusable cross item that can destroy everything on the screen, and there's also a temporary second whip upgrade with dramatic length that fades away after a brief amount of time. Your movement is also a bit more fluid, with freedom to move around while in the air. And overall, it feels really nice to play, while still retaining some of that classic Vania ethos in its deliberate movement and combat. The stages follow along the same locations and theming of the original Haunted Castle, even referencing specific background set pieces and monsters. All of the same bosses return as well, but each with their own all-new behaviors and very creative gimmicks. I absolutely love the new Frankenstein fight, where you have to hit the skeleton dude at a desk to interrupt his remote control electrocution. I'm mostly really impressed at a feeling of reverence for the ideas in the original and giving it some well-deserved attention after it's been generally discarded over the years. My only complaint here would have to be the difficulty level, which I felt shifted too drastically away from the painful challenge put forth by the original Haunted Castle. It does have easy, normal, and hard modes available, but I was able to beat hard mode without continuing after just spending a couple of hours with the game. I'm not opposed to a short but sweet action platformer, but at least one more notch of challenge would be much appreciated by the more hardcore Castlevania players. Beyond this, I suppose I'd either have to try for Deathless, Damageless, or take up speedrunning it, if I wanted to keep going deeper into this one. This remake and the arcade original are also seemingly lacking any sort of achievement system at this point in time, which is not a huge deal to me personally, but a little surprising when the DS games in the collection received a healthy amount of them. But otherwise, it's still very fun and clearly made with passion, and I truly hope this could be another rebirth for the series and a stepping stone to a new and more fleshed out Castlevania title. Now let's go to October 1991. In Japan, Akumajo Dracula would be resurrected once more on the Super Famicom, retelling and reimagining the original journey of Simon Belmont in a truly epic adventure that would be also known as Super Castlevania 4. Yeah, this game is pretty good. Okay, moving on. Okay, so don't worry, Castlevania 4 will get proper coverage later, when we fully delve into the 16-bit era of the series in another video, and I'm skipping over it for now since it's really more considered a loose reimagining and retelling of Simon Belmont's first story as opposed to a remake. Semantics aside, I do want to cover one more title bearing the Akumajo Dracula name that is more nestled in that gray area between reimagining and remake, and that's the one released for the Sharp X68000 line of computers, released exclusively in Japan in 1993, and eventually released again internationally for the PlayStation 1 in 2001 as Castlevania Chronicles. If you're not familiar with the Sharp X68000, it was a home computer system first released in Japan in the late 80s, bearing arcade-quality graphics hardware, leading to a lot of excellent ports of arcade titles and other original games that could easily compete with the other high-powered consoles at the time. Akumajo Dracula was developed in efforts to recreate the original, retaining its story setup and general gameplay mechanics and structure, all while pushing the capabilities of the platform to the limit, and eventually iterating the work into a very special project in its own right. Once again, Simon Belmont takes it upon himself to rid the world of a recently revived Count Dracula, and as you enter the first courtyard, things certainly will feel a bit familiar here, but with a flashy new coat of paint and more flexible controls. Simon can now move more freely in mid-air while jumping, and can also now whip straight down or diagonally down in mid-air. It's not quite the level of attack freedom introduced in Castlevania 4, but I feel that does make it play a little more closely to the original game, while reducing some of the strictness of combat. Otherwise, Simon plays pretty faithfully to the original, slow stair climbing and knockback be damned. The classic sub-weapons and other items have returned as well, with one new addition being a restorative herb that you can use repeatedly in exchange for 10 hearts, and it refills a portion of your life bar. Wallmate is still around too, of course, but you might get trolled a bit in the process of finding it, like how this familiar spot instead unleashes a steady supply of fleamen. From that point in the game, it becomes clear that creative liberties are definitely being taken here, and what may initially be seen as a simple throwback game evolves into having completely redesigned levels with all sorts of fresh ideas and all new hazardous action set pieces. There are 8 stages in total, some of them remixing concepts from the original 6, but also with some references to classic levels and appearances of enemies from other games in the series, even from Haunted Castle. There are also completely new areas to traverse as well, like the slippery ice cave or a sanity testing Tower of Dolls. All in all, the level design is extremely fun and satisfying, as long as you're on board for that signature Classicvania amount of challenge. There are all new boss fights as well, of course, some of which will really test your abilities. One of the more difficult and memorable sections of the game for me was the Clock Tower stage, full of devious enemy placement and dastardly traps, culminating in an epic fight with a lightning-fast werewolf tearing apart the structure itself and hurling the debris towards you. And one fun little gimmick here is also the referencing of the computer's real-time clock, which will affect the actual time shown in the background. And this comes into play again later in the game, where the mural in the hallway before the Grim Reaper fight will reflect the current season. And aside from the clear effort put into breathing new life into this remake, luckily it remains to be an absolute blast to play, as long as you're up for what may be one of the most difficult games in the franchise. It does allow for unlimited continues, and also gives you increased difficulty in further playthroughs after you beat the game, which can gradually ramp up over the course of 6 loops if you feel so inclined. So this take on Akumajo Dracula would be stuck in Japan for 8 years, until eventually it was re-released in 2001 as Castlevania Chronicles for the PS1, which included a port of the X68000 original, along with an all-new arrange mode with some art and gameplay tweaks, and a modest amount of other bonus materials and options. And of course, they had to throw in some new CG cutscenes. The original mode is very similar to what was experienced on original hardware, although there are some very slight differences in timing and enemy patterns that may be noticeable to experienced runners of the game. Otherwise, this is definitely a fine way to experience Akumajo Dracula on a more accessible platform, even down to letting you choose from the different sound module options for the soundtrack, which I forgot to mention earlier, is really good. Regardless of which audio loadout you go with, the FN synthesized original or the Roland MIDI modules, they all sound wonderful and have their own individual flavors to suit whatever your tastes or current mood may be. Arrange mode is an interesting addition to Chronicles as well, with the most notable changes being a red-haired redesign for Simon's sprite, with Ayama Kojima handling the character art, along with a slight alteration of Dracula's sprite, and an entirely new soundtrack by Sota Fujimori, leaning more heavily into dancey electronic sounds. And it's again another nice variable to have depending on your preference. Gameplay-wise, Arrange mode does remove getting knocked back by enemies, so it's really not a bad way to play if you want something a little on the easier side. While Castlevania Chronicles was a bit overlooked at the time, likely thanks to it being released well after the series had already undergone big changes with titles like Symphony of the Night or Castlevania on the N64, it is in my mind a top-notch, pure Classicvania that you really need to try if you haven't already. And that concludes the first episode of our Castlevania journey here. Make sure to stay tuned for when we shall embark on the adventurous 8-bit sequels Simon's Quest and Dracula's Curse, and we'll spin off into the Dark Knight with Kid Dracula, and also shrink down to size into the world of the first handheld Vanias. Yes, even that one. And if you like this video, I did a similar project last year for every Contra game that you might like to check out in the meantime. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you next time. No! Stop doing the thing.
Stop dying. Give me the thing. Oh my god. Oh! No!